In this video, I'm going to show how to replace the track on this late model Skidoo. The steps to this in general apply to really every snowmobile, but this one specifically is a 2021 Mxz850. It's the XRS version, which has a little more adjustability in the suspension. But in terms of more later model Skidoos, the specific steps are very, very similar. Okay, so a few different ways to do this, but I think the best way to go about it is to remove the suspension apparatus first. So before I lifted up the sled, I actually did put some straps underneath here, right here and back there. That just will keep the suspension from unloading once the whole apparatus is removed. That'll keep it a little more compressed, make it a little easier to get back in there. Now, believe it or not, this whole suspension setup is actually only held underneath the snowmobile by 4 different bolts. Now in this case, there's two 16 millimeter, one here and one on the other side, and then 16 millimeter here, which has a 17 millimeter nut on the opposite side. Now on some sleds though, this bolt would have a corresponding bolt exactly on the opposite side with a rod in between there, a shaft. And if you remove one completely, then that shaft spins as you try to remove the other one. So if that is your situation, I recommend loosening one up to break the thread sealer on there, loosening it up quite a bit, almost till it's out, and then putting it back in, tightening it, and then taking out the other side. And then when you try to take this one out, usually that'll come out okay. I've seen some people place a wrench or even screwdrivers to kind of pry out to put a little bit of outward force on that shaft as you remove that, so that works as well. In this case, I don't have to do any of that because there's just a nut on the opposite side underneath there. So I have my 17 millimeter wrench, 16 millimeter hex head socket on an impact. Impacts are awfully nice for these. And then we'll get that all taken care of. All right, so where the process for the Skidoos with the R motion system diverge a little bit from normal sleds is they have that bolt there, but it's held in place on the back with a insert that requires a thin wrench. Okay, so they do sell these online specifically for this application. You can buy for $12 to $15 plus shipping. You can buy a 22 millimeter wrench. Now I didn't elect to do that. I bought a whole set like this. Not the highest quality, but they're decent, and this whole set was like $25. So for twice the price of one wrench, I got an entire set. So that's the way I would go. He has something like this too, an adjustable that may work as well. All right, but basically that just fits up there like this, just like that, and then you're able to get that bolt off. And with that bolt off, those ones off on both sides, we can undo these adjusters a bit just to take off some of the tension on the track, and then that whole suspension apparatus will come out. All right, so now the suspension apparatus is all out of there. And to do that, I just used 16 millimeter sockets there. That's a 10 millimeter And then as mentioned, you have that 22 millimeter thin one right here. And I always recommend putting nuts and bolts back where you can whenever possible, so that way you don't forget where they came from. And now with it all out of there, you can see how some straps placed in different locations like that keep this from fully decompressing. So it's a little more compact. When we go to put that back in there, it'll be a little bit easier to do that. All right, now the next step I'd recommend is doing the disc brake apparatus side. Reason is because after you get this ready to take off, you have to either use a pulling tool or pry it off. And if you do the other side, then you won't have anything to pry against. The whole thing will start to move out. So next step is this side. All right, so how we go about doing that, there are 4 Torx bits in there. Those are T40s. And then you have this snap ring there. And then once those things are done, there's this little tiny tab right in there. And all you need to get that out is just a screwdriver and a hammer and a little tap down this way, and that whole plate will fall off, okay? And then you'd be able to pull this whole thing off. And you can get in there with a good heavy-duty screwdriver, pry bar, whatever you can. Just try to pry it off evenly so you don't bend or break or, distort things at all. All right, so let's get this done. So here's the tools that you're going to need. So you need your snap ring, pliers like that, a good heavy-duty screwdriver or pry bar, your T40 like that, and a ratchet or impact like that, okay? Oh, and if you do want to change your pads, you need to remove that pin there, which is a 5 millimeter hex head. So for this lower one, sometimes there's a little access hole under there on some sleds, and this one, it's not a perfectly straight shot, and there's no access hole. So I did use just a little universal extension there, universal joint, which should help a little bit of flexibility, making that a little straighter. And that's doing a fine job. So as shown, that bottom one isn't quite straight on. Don't be like me and get impatient. I actually was able to break it free just fine with that universal joint with the extension. But then I got impatient. It was going kind of slow, so I used my impact instead of what I should have done, is just use a regular ratchet. And I stripped it out. So I ended up having to use an extractor set, which comes with a piece like this. So you get a drill bit, which drills out to the appropriate diameter, and then you have this, which as you rotate it to the left, it kind of grips on and bites, and usually can get those out of there as long as they're not too stuck. But you can see now that bolt is basically wrecked, so I need a new Torx bolt. And I actually drilled just a little far. It still worked, but you can see how I almost completely lost the head of that, which probably would have been fine. I would just have to get it out with the vice grips later. But in any case, be patient. Don't make the mistake I did. Just learn from me. All right, so next step is to tap that little tab downward. Use a good quality screwdriver, or these are actually really nice because the shaft is connected all the way through, so you don't end up pounding on your plastic handle. But just a little taparoo on there, and that should free that up. All right, you can see why you have to pry just a little bit to get that off, because you can see this inner mating surface of that caliper bracket assembly it gets kind of rusted or fixed on to this outer part of that bearing. So you just gentle coaxing with pry bars. You don't want to go crazy because this metal will flex and bend. So, but just you do even on both sides and eventually it'll come off. All right, now that we got the brake side off, I can move to the drive side. And a lot of these Skidoos are going to have a few different kinds of fasteners holding this on. And as I mentioned before, most of them you're going to have to take the exhaust off. This one's a little more low profile, so I think I can get away without doing that because you got to take the hood off and everything to remove the exhaust. But in any case, these are all 10 millimeter on here, and then there's a Torx 40 there. A lot of other ones, there will be some Torx 30s in there. So basically, in general, you got a combination of 10 millimeter Torx 40s and Torx 30s. This one has mostly 10 millimeters. You'll need a snap ring remover, pliers once you get in there, and a small screwdriver helps. That helps to pry that off and to get some of these connectors off, like speedometer and such. So we'll move that out of the way, remove that, get all of our peripheral bolts / fasteners off, and then we'll be able to take that case off. Important to have your oil drain pan underneath, because once you start to remove enough of these, it will start draining oil. Okay? And then just make sure you keep organized with what fasteners you have so you don't lose them. Okay? All right, now that cover is off, and this connector would have been easier to get to if I had taken the exhaust off, but I made it work. So basically what I did is I just pushed that little piece through the holder in there with a flat head, and then I was able to twist this around. Once you do that, you just depress that little clip right there, and then you can just take that off. The only other thing to keep in mind is hidden by that was another Torx 40, and then I did label those because that center one has that little washer on, so numbered that one 1 on the bolt and on the cover, and then did the same thing for these other 2. Other than those 3, these are all the same, at least on this model. But gist of it is just stay organized with your fasteners, okay? And then we can take off the tension on this chain and then use our O-ring pliers to take that O-ring off. Then once I get that lower gear off, then we can get that whole drive assembly out. All right, so the way to take tension off that drive chain is to loosen this threaded shaft here, okay? And you can see that actually holds tension on this piece here, and if we rotate this counterclockwise, accessible here, we can take that tension off. So that is a Torx 25 or T25, and it has this clip here to prevent it from rotating during operation. So first we remove this, Oh, try not to drop it like I did. I'll grab that with a magnet. And then Torx 25 on an extension. You can get to that pretty well, okay? All right, so after that clip is off, then this gear just basically slides right off real easy, just like that. And then we'll take that, put it in a clean spot, and then we can pull that drive shaft all the way through. It takes a little finagling, but then that whole track system will come off. All right, so now what you want to do is you want to actually pull that track forward. So pulling this whole piece up that way you can disengage the track from the drive, okay? That will allow you to take that whole drive system and pull it this way, so pull it to the left. That will extend that shaft out further on this side, disengaging it from the other side, and then the whole shaft can drop down and you'll get the whole track out, okay? All right, so this is a track I selected, made by Mxz850, and they make a ton of OE stuff and really great aftermarket tracks. The company I got it from, they have a way to look up on their website which one will fit your sled, but just be cautious. These are expensive. You don't want to screw that up. And these run anywhere from around $700 to $1,000. So just make sure you get the right size. See the size there. This is studded just like the OE, and you can see that nice looking track there. It's got the built-in studs, concave paddles there. It's a little bit deeper in the center than it is on the side. Should give pretty good overall handling. All right, now we can move towards getting the track installed. And really want to point out, because it's very important that you have this going the correct direction. There's these arrows here. They're sort of subtle. I've added a little paint just to highlight those. But in any case, just be careful that you got that going the right way. So we'll get that underneath the sled. We'll have it as forward as possible. That way we can, just like with removal, we can have these teeth disengaged from the track so we can move this back and forth. We'll first place the brake side in, so kind of just like the removal. And then once that's all the way in, then we can slide that up and over through the drive side. All right, now that the track is back in place with the drive, we can put the drive side back together, first placing the gear on and then the O-ring, and then we'll get the chain tensioned and the cover back on. Now, these are 6mm threads. These ones are 8mm. You don't necessarily have to torque them. You can do good and tight, but in general, I usually put these around 7 to 8 foot-pounds or so, and these ones around 15 to 20 foot-pounds, okay? It doesn't have to be exact, but you really don't want to go crazy. These are aluminum threads. You don't want to strip that out, and you also don't want your bolts coming free. At least these ones need thread sealer, but I would recommend thread sealer on all of them, okay? The last thing you want is any of that stuff coming loose, okay? On the opposite side, for the brake, I do recommend a little bit of anti-seize or a good quality grease around here. That'll make it easier to come apart in the future. You can see how that rusts a bit, okay? And then you have these are 8mm threads that go and hold the brake plate in place. And those can, again, be torqued, I would say, in general, to about 15 to 20 foot-pounds with the thread sealer on them. But before you get to that step, you have to put that backing plate in place, okay? And you'll know it's clocked correctly, meaning it's engaged correctly, when the threads line up with those holes, okay? So let's move forward and see how this goes. All right, next step is we are going to tension our chain. And to do that, we are going to tighten or go clockwise on that Torx bit there, which I think is a 25. Yep, T25. And you don't want to go crazy on that. You want to tighten it just enough that there's just a bit of slack on that chain. You're not torquing on that piece there, okay? You can see as I turn that, it draws that tensioner in, and we'll see the slack start to come out of the chain. Still quite a bit of slack, see that? You can see the slack starting to come out a bit. So that's probably just a pinch too tight. Want just a little bit of movement. It's pretty close though. So something just about that or slightly less. So let's just come off just a pinch. And that's probably too much slack, okay? So we'll just kind of ease up on it there. It's probably still just a bit too much there. Yep, something just like that is just about right. Not super tight or you could break things and have excessive wear, not too loose where you have it skipping teeth and making noise, okay? Also, don't forget that cotter pin that goes in there. You may have to clock that fastener just a little bit in order to be able to get that hole straight up and down to get your pin in. I would go on a little bit of the tighter side than looser, but in any case, don't forget that step. There we are. All right, so when your chain is appropriately tensioned, it should be something like this. So you can see I'm putting a little bit of force on there, back and forth, and there's a little bit of movement, but it's not a lot, okay? So you don't want to be too tight, you don't want to be too loose. So something like this. All right, so now you can tell that that plate is appropriately aligned. And the way I did that is I used one hand to raise that up a little bit and just positioned it with my other hand. So you have these two tabs that are poking out on both the top and the bottom, and those bolt holes are lined up now, okay? So that's how you know. All right, so those bolts are now in place, and I torqued those to about 15 foot-pounds with some blue thread sealer on them. I had to use that replacement in there because I messed up that bolt as previously mentioned, which is no big deal. Just make sure you use a low-profile bolt like that, because even though it might clear when you have good pad depth, as those pads wear out, that can get closer with limiting clearance, okay? But looking good so far. We'll get that O-ring on there, or snap ring there, and then get everything else installed, and then we'll move on to the suspension. All right, so now I got that snap ring in place. Just be a little bit cautious that when you get that in, it's actually fully seated in that groove. I realized at first when I was putting mine on, it wasn't getting into that groove, so I had to kind of pound on the base of the rotor sort of relatively gently to push it in, seat it in a little bit further, so that way I had access to that groove. And then now you can see that that snap ring is appropriately positioned all the way in that groove. All right, now we can get the suspension components put in place. But before you do that, it is a good opportunity to make sure everything's tight. Make sure you got areas that you can access greased, including your zerks back there. So just go through things while you got good visualization of it all. Now, admittedly, this job is much easier with two people, but it is a little easier with one person when you got your suspension still compressed a bit, and these adjusters all the way loosened up so you can move that all the way forward. Okay? All right, so the track assembly is all back together, and I have those two fasteners torqued there. Now, I don't know the official torques, but those are 10 millimeter threaded sections on the bolts, which typically go somewhere between 35-ish up to about 45 foot-pounds. I went on the higher end, just about 45 foot-pounds. And that's a 16 millimeter hex head that you'll use there. And on that one, you need a 16 millimeter for the bolt or hex head and a 17 millimeter for the nut, okay? Once you have those on and torqued, then you can go to adjusting your track. You want it tight, but not too tight. It will stretch a little bit and break in. But that's a 10 millimeter hex head to adapt or to work with those adjusters there, okay? One final thing before you get your panels on and start riding is you got to fill that with oil. That oil goes right in there where that rubber piece is there. I recommend using Skidoo XPS oil, which comes in the correct volume. It's a good synthetic oil. It has exactly the amount you need. So I just go ahead and use that. Just don't forget that step. Then get the panels back on and you're ready to rock and roll. Okay, thanks for checking out the video. Please let me know if you got questions, comments, suggestions, and go ahead and please subscribe.